After 30 glorious years of growth, the American economy was in trouble.
The economy basically was kind of going nowhere and had inflation, which didn't seem to get cured, and kind of a malaise in the economy.
Stagflation was the end of naive Keynesianism. You had two things at the same time, which under the Keynesian view would have been impossible. You had stagnation in the economy, a high level of unemployment. You had inflation with prices rising rapidly.
President Nixon looked like a Chicago economist's dream come true. Milton Friedman was a special advisor, and George Shultz was in charge of the budget.
About the wholesale price index a moment ago. One of the big areas where prices were going up at wholesale very rapidly was lumber and other materials associated with home building.
But the president wasn't listening. He tried to spend his way out of trouble.
Going to wind up having its impact on the cost.
To add insult to injury, he declared, "Now I'm a Keynesian."
This declaration by Nixon horrified his conservative supporters. Indeed, one congressman wrote him, said, "Mr. President, I'm going to have to burn all of my old speeches." And Nixon wrote back to him, "I will too."
Nixon decided he hadn't gone far enough. So he took his top economic advisors off to Camp David for a working weekend. Ben Stein, the quiz show host, was a junior speechwriter in the White House, and his father was at the meeting.
Here's my father walking into the president's cabin to meet Mr. Nixon, and there's George Shultz right behind him. I'm not sure, but I think it's a fair bet that at any one of these meetings, they're complaining about something being wrong. Probably talking about prices and stagflation. I'm not sure.
Dick Cheney was a young aide at the time.
I always remember a debate we had during the Nixon administration when the public was convinced that food prices were going up. So the political debate was whether or not we should impose a freeze on food prices.
The supposedly conservative Republican Nixon opted for wage and price controls.
Nixon was a great one for doing something. I think, in retrospect, we now know it would have been better to do nothing, but he was in favor of doing something.
I was there, and I opposed them. Wage and price controls, you could see analytically, would get you in a lot of trouble.
Time has come for a new economic policy for the United States. Its targets are unemployment, inflation.
At one point, President Nixon spoke up and quoted Nikita Khrushchev. And he said, Khrushchev once told me that sometimes in order to be a statesman, you have to be a politician for a while.
The problem with him was that he was willing to sacrifice principle too easily for political advantage.
The voters liked the president's war on prices. Nixon was reelected in a landslide. The economy did less well.
Right away, the economy went out of whack. People couldn't cover their costs. Ranchers stopped sending cattle to market. Farmers started drowning their chickens. Instead of controlling inflation, they were creating shortages.
And prices just kept on rising.
The last time I saw Nixon in the Oval Office was George Shultz. President Nixon said to me, "Don't blame George for this silly business of wage and price control," meaning George Shultz. And I said to him, "Oh no, Mr. President, I don't blame George. I blame you."
Britain's mixed economy, so widely imitated, was in similar trouble. It too was facing the deadly combination of unemployment and inflation. In theory, the Conservative Prime Minister Ted Heath and his cabinet believed in markets. In practice, like Nixon, they made a sharp U-turn and used wage and price controls to combat stagflation.
I was a junior minister in Ted Heath's government, and I remember having to attend meetings of 3 or 4 other ministers where we would actually decide the level of charges plumbers could charge next week to repair taps, and how much taxi drivers could charge for fares, and how much hairdressers should get in wages. It was absolutely unbelievable. It all came to a very sticky end, a complete collapse.
A coal miners' strike and an oil crisis plunged the country into darkness. Voters blamed Ted Heath and voted the Conservatives out of office.
Well, we're virtually out of business while the power's off. We've got no sense that we can operate at all.
We were the sick man of Europe. The English disease was the disease of strikes, which we had all over the place. And you know, it was so bad that Herman Kahn of the Hudson Institute wrote a book called The Year 2000. And he saw many things, but the one thing he did see was that the lower standard of living in Europe in the year 2000 would be shared between Albania and the United Kingdom. Albania.
A minister in the defeated government, Keith Joseph may have been an unworldly intellectual, but his search for fresh answers would change the way not only Britain, but the world thought about economics and society.
Keith wore a hair shirt. He beat his breast and said we were to blame. We've got it wrong. And he did beat his breast. He was called a mad monk.
I thought I was a Conservative. But all the time I was in favour of shortcuts to utopia. I was in favour of the government doing things because I was so impatient for good things to be done.
And when he appeared on television, he had a vein in his head which kept throbbing. And people said, oh, this is a very strange figure indeed, this man.
It's only to be expected.
But nonetheless, he started the rethink of Conservative policy.
Keith Joseph's search brought him here, where, with Hayek's encouragement, a group of kindred spirits had set up a think tank called the Institute of Economic Affairs.
The Institute started in 1957, you could say, as a direct result of the Montpellier Society, of the Road to Serfdom, of Hayek's ideas of freedom and competitive enterprise.
With the zeal of a convert, Joseph began to preach the virtues of free markets. In a series of pamphlets, he went on the intellectual offensive, attacking the mixed economy, making the case for capitalism. Mark Garnett is a biographer of Keith Joseph.
From the middle of 1974, Joseph undertakes a crusade to convert the country to his way of thinking. And what he wants to do is to take the battle to the heart of the enemy camp. And he believed that the universities were infected with socialist thinking.
Because it was a free society in this country,
and he was going right into the lion's den, arguing a case that many people had never heard before.
Joseph felt that it was his duty to fight back on behalf of the free market.
To revive the economy, Joseph preached that Britain needed more risk-taking, which meant more bankrupts and more millionaires, and less equality.
Well, the audience would sort of gasp. They'd never heard anybody challenging the consensus.
Mild inflation seemed a painless way of maintaining full employment, encouraging growth and expanding the social services. So the result is that we're now more socialist in many ways than any other developed country outside the communist bloc.
He used to be smuggled in the back door. He was genuinely hurt that the students had reacted to this penetrating argument by chucking flour bombs at him.
It was almost a badge of honour that he would come away from these meetings with egg yolk running down his suit.
Keith Joseph's most significant adherent was an up-and-coming conservative politician named Margaret Thatcher. In Parliament and politics, Thatcher's closest friends agree that Keith Joseph's influence on her was crucial.
She relied on him to give her deep intellectual support. There's nothing wrong with intuition. Intuition is reason in a hurry. And Keith just supported and reinforced her intuition at the very moment she needed that support.
Margaret Thatcher had a gut instinct for market economics. Her father had been a grocer, and when she was a girl, she had helped him in the shop. Hard-working and studious, she won a place at Oxford University, where she became interested in student politics. While she was at Oxford, she read Hayek's Road to Serfdom. It made a lasting impression on her. Years later, when she became the first woman to lead the Conservative Party, she once slammed Hayek's book down on a table and announced, "This is what we believe."
Thatcher's office came on and said, could she come and drop in to see him? And so she called by, and there was a period of unaccustomed silence from Margaret Thatcher as she sat there, intense, attending to the master's words.
By 1974, Hayek sensed the world beginning to go his way.
So far as the movement of intellectual opinion is concerned, it is now, for the first time in my life, moving in the right direction.
In the battle of ideas, 1974 was a turning point. Hayek's Nobel Prize came as a surprise, but the balance was now shifting away from Keynes and towards Hayek.
I'd like to say that when I was a young man, only the very old men still believed in a free market system. When I was in my middle ages, almost I myself and nobody else believed in it. And now I have the pleasure of having lived long enough to see that the young people believe again in it. Now that is a very important change.